after those positive and optimistic words from the panel members, I'm chairing the Q&A. I would like to introduce the Q&A by stressing the importance that in a hub book we gave to the participation of scholars from different parts of the globe, because we think that environmental accounting, sustainability is only possible with the participation of different regions, different perspectives, and that this is reflected in the different chapters that as we've seen in the video. Just for starting with one question, I watching again the video, I saw that there is a tension between what Mercy and also Ekbom said about diversity, different voices, and at the same time this idea that to make progress we shouldn't rely on pockets of knowledge. So we shouldn't be isolated in different. So it's like there is a tension between we need more perspectives, and at the same time we need to have we need to look for like a universal perspective, work together to achieve something. So how this could be achieved or developed in environmental accounting? Do you have any views, Matt?
I've always got views, unfortunately. So, well, partly from working on a lot of editing of the videos and stuff, I'd rewatched that video a couple of times, and I really liked that idea of the network analysis that you brought up in there about making the network denser, and I think something that came out in the video, the comments that everybody was bringing up, particularly at the end, about telling our stories and absences of voices. I really feel like it's there's this underlying there's this need to build confidence, right? So if you're a PhD student or you're developing your research and you're trying to look for what markets do I run this study in? I feel like right now it's the easy answer is to okay, let's do a study within the US because the US has these easily accessible data sets and stuff like that. But and I'm glad this is happening. I feel, and actually correct me if I'm wrong, I feel as though the appetite for just these same kinds of studies that reproduce things from a US or US Western European perspective are not gaining as much traction as they once were. So when I think about what would build these what builds these connections, I've been trying to think a lot about forums like this, smaller discussion forums or webinars where we actually front end researchers that are not from a North American, Western European context to tell their stories and to give them opportunities to build that confidence that I don't think really exists if you're looking to build your research on Google Scholar, right? You type in something about corporate governance, you're gonna get a lot of stuff out of the U.S., out of the Western European perspectives. Not saying that there's not research out there that doesn't fulfill those perspectives, but I keep trying to think a lot about new forums and new ways to connect people so that to build confidence, so to make that network denser and to connect people so that you get researchers from around Africa or around the Pacific Islands, around Asia, to draw them together. It's almost like the strength in numbers is essentially what I'm making an elongated point around. It's the strength in numbers. And I really do feel like that's the promising path forward for environmental accounting, to connect people together and to embolden them by making those connections. I don't know if Tiffany, if you wanted to say something on it as well.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and edited this video. But I think it's a great opportunity to organize the webinar, and it's interesting to hear different voice from, especially from Africa, and like we have the voice from North America and Pacific region, and it's interesting to get people around and share the view, and we are working in the same thing and try to make the change and also educate next generation and have tried to promote this to the broader audience. I think is a very good exercise and a good idea to bring all these people together working in the same thing. So I think, yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt. Do this video. This is my first time to watch this video after your editing. Yeah, spend so much time to select the key information and also the good saying from our talk. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So what I take from what you said, Matt, is that, I mean, we are talking about something that is, important, maybe a little bit utopian. So it's difficult. It's bringing, I mean, it requires a lot of work. And we've seen the difficulties in, for example, when we recorded the video, it was impossible to bring together everyone because, because of the geography, because of the time zone. So there is a lot of work to bridge different cultures and to, avoid the narrow discourse of research that we, as Glenn was also discussing in the video, the narrow discourse of research that we are experiencing right now.
Kind of ties in a little bit to stuff that Rob and other people saying in the other panel. Was all about this kind of this calculative kind of capture of accounting and this kind of obsession. And as I was listening to everyone that was kind of speaking, I got a kind of sense that question just came in my head was, do numbers have the same resonance in these other spaces? We kind of we have this kind of idea numbers dominate targets and things like that. And the extent to which that is actually maybe it's a cultural phenomenon. It's not a human phenomenon, and the extent to which it's maybe a hidden curriculum that kind of influences very much of what we do. So it's just a kind of a general kind of sense in that regard about that kind of question. Yeah.
I don't know if Tiffany or Matt, did you have?
Yep. So I had two things when I saw the question in the chat, Ian. First one was that this is something that Glenn has talked a lot about how he mentioned in the video, he was talking about like the snake and how a snake has like a different connotation inside of the Pacific cultures versus Western cultures. And Glenn, I wish he was here to kind of about this back and forth, but Glenn has a lot of different instances of where there is this kind of, to tie it to quantification, there's this Western idea of quantification and the power of numbers that maybe holds in a non-Western context if you tie it to funding or you tie it to something else to make it important. But with in everyday conversations, it doesn't carry the same weight, and people don't interact in the same way. And that's kind of the hubris of Western cultures, I think, imposing themselves on other areas of the world. The second thing was that those differences, I think, come up like, okay, again, the weight of quantification. I'm trying to learn French right now, right? I've got a rudimentary understanding and getting into conversations with people. But one thing that I find really funny in English is, or one thing I find funny in French is that when I'm trying to speak to people in English, I've spent years trying to illustrate the politics within financial decision making in English. But when I start trying to explain things to people in French, and it could also be that these people are from around North Africa, but I'll be explaining the politics behind something in French, and it's immediate. The frame, it's not that the words are different. It's like the way you're explaining yourself is different, which I'm sure Carlos has plenty of expertise in having to, the differences between explaining yourself in different languages. But these ideas do not, you can translate them, but the sense comes off differently in different languages and the way that the cultures interact. Yeah, those are the two things that I thought when I'd seen the question. I don't know, Tiffany, if you want to go.
Yeah, okay, from my camera. Okay, yeah, I think environmental accounting is mostly streamed from the Western and the European countries, and most of our people in our context are fancy about the numbers, and they like the quantitative methods, and also try to learn this and use different software and also quantitative methods to present their work. And I would say that especially some companies and in Asian countries, and they would like to adopt the Western style and Western thinking to apply in the Asian context. But I would say that like some of the interesting culture, like Chinese culture and the Japanese culture, and they have some specific Asian management style that we could learn. I mean, we can contribute, and what we call is like born global culture that other people can learn from us. Yeah, so like especially some of the cultural things like Buddhism, Taoism, how they combine these nature and accounting or the numbers together and try how to translate and interpret it in a different way. So, but I mentioned this in the video if you had heard this before. And so I think some of the people, especially the student in Asian context, Asian areas, they try to adopt the Western thinking and try to learn it very, very hard and so hard, but we don't understand the essence. And so, but we can think another way one, and how can we develop our own thinking and not purely from the Western culture, and also maybe stem from our own context to think about in our own way, or maybe have our own different interpretation can contribute to you guys. Yeah, just a thought. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean the question of what is behind the communication. Communication is very broad. It's not just the language, it's not just the number, but it's a lot of things. The interpretation of those numbers of this language, which is also changing from one culture to another. So this is another issue that is very important. And I think that Matthias is asking something that is somehow related to this. So Matthias, are you willing to? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks. And yes, indeed, I think what I was thinking about was pretty much related to what you folks were discussing. Again, related to cultural, political, religion, other things. The perception of time, for instance, as well as the dependence of, say, indigenous people and their traditions in their dependency with and interconnection with nature. So, I mean, within Western Anglo-American societies, we're very much corporations, organizations are working on a short time span. We're going through like a short 3 months, 6 months, 1 year period, and looking into risks and dependencies in certain ways. But then how we understand, for instance, dependencies, how we're dependent on ecosystem services, we're dependent on certain types of species within an area. If you are sort of learned to be within your own culture, that, well, our community is based on a longer time span or a cyclical time span compared to a very linear Western way of seeing things. So whether whether there would be things to learn from different perspectives of time, understandings of nature related to risks and dependencies would be one thing I think we might also consider, related to what Ian mentioned about numbers and their role in different places. Not sure whether anyone was able to kind of follow that thinking, but let's see. I'll throw it back to you, Carlos.
Thank you. Anyone from any participant can also answer or make another questions or contribute to this conversation. Of course, what I've been told from my Latin American colleagues who are studying, First Nations in South America, they and what I have read about that is that some nations, some people, they don't make a separation between them and nature. So, and this is why, for example, a colleague, Hector Sarmiento, who is researching the way First Nations understand the relationship with nature and how this could be reflected in, environmental accounting, and which is the role of environmental accounting in this respect. And the main conflict is about land. Why land? Because they don't conceive land as something that could be marketed. They are part of. Land is themselves. So it's very difficult for them to make So in some cultures, maybe not in all, but in some cultures, society and nature are not separated, and is the notion of dependencies probably derives from a separation between nature and society. And we know that this separation between nature and society has a lot to do with Western religion and with modernity and so on and so forth. So probably this is something quite specific to some cultures and some religions and some historical developments. And in this ecological crisis, we need to know a little bit. We need to know a little bit about how this is conceived in other cultures. And so this is an amazing, a huge open question for further research, and I think that those issues are very interesting for. I'm sorry because I'm supposed to facilitate the Q&A and I'm answering, but Matt.
Yeah, no. One thing I wanted to quickly bring up from Matthias's point was this idea, and Carlos, you touched on it too, was this idea of time with decision making. And I think it's really applicable inside of the environmental accounting space, because we have these Western linear notions of time where, okay, we have 1 month to make this decision, and then we can kind of backtrack. What are how are we going to, what kind of stakeholder engagement are we going to have inside of that month to figure out how we're going to make a decision, right? When I was doing my PhD, I had a lot of support from a woman named Effin Kuppen that was doing policy development, and she was looking at cultural differences inside of policy development. and was identifying things like in the Netherlands, the way that people argue and the way that they deal with conflict is vastly different from like the English, or in my case, I was looking in New Zealand, right? The Dutch people tend to have all the conflict front-ended. They get into these arguments, they all kind of flesh things out, and then it's like they're in a sprint to find the middle ground consensus to then move the discussion forward. Whereas in more English or in a New Zealand context, there's a lot of positioning early on. Not a lot of conflict. People don't want to get in conflict, and then towards the end, everyone's rushing to find a happy middle ground. But then the thing that kind of throws this, that turns all that upside down, is that if you start looking towards indigenous literature, the time frame, they don't enter into conversation saying, okay, now we're all going to, 15 minutes of taking turns and 15 minutes of discussing what the problem is, and then we'll move on to that. It's not as structured. And I think that, just like to reiterate what Carlos was saying, I think it's there's a huge discrepancy between this linear decision making, where it's this linear process that you can just kind of work your way through, and kind of open-ended decision making. Because I don't think that open-ended decision making that is more prevalent in indigenous communities, I don't think that fits in with the main models of business decision making, especially around the environment that we have today. I don't think that they line up very well, not even at all, let's say.
Yeah. Any other question? Jan has a question, please.
I might sort of pass this over to the final discussion, because I know we're up against time. But one of the things that I've been observing, particularly in the sustainability science literature, that has quite a lot of capturing big data flows, and so being able to articulate, for example, where seafood protein moves between one location and another. There are pictures of how the resources, whether it be material resources like potassium or sand or whatever, as well as lived resources, move around the globe. And I know that's a very, that sort of jars in some ways at the end of, because it's a very sort of modern conception and big data, but I wonder whether or not big data changes the terms of conversation about environmental accounting, because you can see the extent to which parts of the globe are being exploited and the materials flow elsewhere from where they were, and the exchange that is available and around those resources is meager compared with the amount that's lost. So maybe that's something for the final session about the role of big data technology and enhancing our environmental accounting and accountability mechanisms. But it seemed to me that it wasn't unrelevant to the conversation that we've just had as well.
I think it is relevant, and this brings to the discussion about accounting for resources and and the focus on issues that are considered relevant from a Western perspective, as opposed to also questions that are. But I think that in Latin America, for example, there is a clear understanding of this situation, and if maybe we can continue this conversation in the final discussion, because it's time now.